It's 6:15 on a Wednesday morning, and you're locking a bike to the rack outside Ferris Metalworks. The chain is rusted at one link. The seat is held together with electrical tape. If someone stole this bike, you'd be almost relieved. Dana pulls into the lot in a new Ford Explorer, the kind with the third row nobody uses. She waves. You wave back. She parks 2 spots from the bike rack like she does every morning, like there's some unspoken rule that the woman with the good SUV gets the good spot. You clip your badge to your shirt and walk in past her. The bike outside is worth maybe $140. The account on your phone, the one nobody at this plant has ever seen, crossed $432,000 last Sunday. Nobody here knows that. Not Dana, not your supervisor, not the guy in receiving who calls you bike guy like it's a personality. You've thought about telling someone. You never do. Here's what nobody tells you about getting rich quietly. It doesn't feel like winning. It feels like carrying a secret you're not sure is good news. 6 years ago, none of this existed. Not the number, not the habit, not the strange calm that comes with watching money move on its own. 6 years ago, you were the kind of broke where a flat tire was a crisis. This is that story. How a guy who couldn't afford new brake pads ended up richer than almost everyone he worked with. And how that turned out to be a more complicated thing to carry than he expected. Level 1. The first $100. You're 24. Rent is $1,050 for a 1-bedroom above a laundromat. Take-home pay is $3,180 a month if nobody takes a sick day and the overtime holds. Checking account? $211 on a Tuesday, 4 days before payday. The bike isn't a lifestyle choice yet, it's the only choice. Your car, a Honda with 190,000 miles on it, needs a timing belt, and the shop quoted you $640. You don't have $640. You have $211 and a due date on rent. You bike to work for 11 weeks while the Honda sits in your landlord's driveway like something dying slowly. At the plant, Walt runs the CNC machines 2 stations down. He's 61, wears the same navy jacket every day, and has said maybe 40 words to you total in 3 months. One afternoon, watching you eat a peanut butter sandwich instead of buying from the vending machine, he says the only thing he'll say to you for another year: pay yourself first, before you convince yourself you can't afford to. You don't ask what he means. You look it up that night on your phone, sitting on the mattress on the floor, the one you haven't bought a frame for yet. It means before rent, before groceries, before anything. You move something toward the future first, and you let everything else fight over what's left. You open a brokerage account. You set up an automatic transfer of $50 every Friday into a target date index fund. $50, less than what Dana, 2 stations over, spends on her nails every 3 weeks. The first automatic withdrawal fails. Insufficient funds. You feel it like a small public failure, even though no one saw it. You move the transfer date to Monday, right after payday, before you can talk yourself out of it. It works the second time. $50 leaves. $211 becomes $161. You don't feel wealthy. You feel exposed, like you've admitted something to yourself by trying. 3 months later, the Honda gets its timing belt on a payment plan at 0% for 6 months if paid on time. You pay it on time. You don't know it yet, but that single decision, not putting it on a high-interest card, will matter more than the actual repair. By the end of the year, the account holds $2,600. It's not much, but it is, for the first time in your adult life, money that exists for a reason other than surviving the next 14 days. You don't tell anyone about it, not because it's a secret exactly, but because there's nothing to say. I have $2,600 in an index fund isn't a sentence that means anything to the people around you at 24. Dana would ask why you're not just enjoying your 20s. Your roommate would ask what an index fund even is. So you say nothing, and you keep biking past the dealership on the corner without slowing down to look. Here's what nobody tells you about the first year. The amount barely matters. $2,600 will not change your life. What changes your life is that the transfer now happens without a decision attached to it. You stop negotiating with yourself every Monday. That's the actual milestone, not the number, the absence of the argument. Level 2. The boring years. You get a raise, 3%, standard, cost of living. You don't increase your spending, you increase the transfer. $50 becomes $75. Meg doesn't understand the account, not fully, not yet. But she notices you don't panic the way other people do when something breaks. When her transmission fails a year later, you're the one who calmly walks her through getting 3 quotes instead of taking the first one. 3 years in, the account crosses $25,000 on an ordinary Sunday morning while you're making coffee. You check it, feel something close to disbelief, and then go fold laundry. You do the math once out of curiosity. If Dana's $600 a month car payment had gone into the same fund instead, at the same pace you'd been investing, she'd be sitting on more than you were. Same number, same mechanism, different direction. You never say this to her. It wouldn't help either of you. Level 3. When the number becomes real. At 28, you get promoted to lead technician. The raise is real this time. $8,400 more a year. The email lands on a Thursday afternoon. You read the number twice. Before your lunch break is over, there's already a tab open in your browser. A dealership, 20 minutes from the plant, selling a certified pre-owned truck you've looked at 3 times in the last 2 years without letting yourself click Contact Dealer. For the first time, the monthly payment doesn't look impossible. $410 a month. You could do it. You sit with the tab open for 2 days. Then you do the math on what $410 a month, invested instead, would become in 30 years at a historical long-run market average. It's not a small number. It's not a number you can unknow. You buy new brake pads for the Honda instead. $140. You keep the bike for commuting when the weather holds. That same year, the market drops sharply. A broad decline of roughly 20% over a few brutal months. Your account, which had crossed $100,000 for the first time in June, is back down to $79,000 by October. You don't sell. You want to. You open the app 4 times a day for a week, which is its own kind of admission. Walt, now retired but still coming by the plant to see old coworkers, hears you mention it in the break room. You only lose money if you sell, he says, buttoning his jacket. Everything else is just the number being loud for a while. You leave the transfer running. $75 a week, then $100, keeps going in while the market is down, buying more shares for less money without you having to think about it. By the following spring, the account recovers, then passes its old high. It crosses $121,000 on a random Tuesday you don't even remember afterward. Somewhere in that year, without a specific moment you can point to, the panic response starts to change. A $600 number used to ruin your week. Now, it's an inconvenience. The scale of what actually rattles you has quietly moved. That fall, the Honda finally dies for good. A cracked engine block, not worth fixing. You buy a 5-year-old sedan with 61,000 miles on it, paying $14,300 in cash, and you feel almost nothing doing it. No dealership financing, no monthly payment to negotiate down, no tab left open in your browser for 2 anxious days. You still keep the bike. It's not a financial decision anymore. You've just started to like the ride. Level 4. The crossover. You're 31. Meg, now your wife, gets a bill from an oral surgeon. $2,150 for a wisdom tooth extraction their insurance mostly declines to cover. 2 years ago, this would have meant a payment plan and a stretch of tight months. Now you transfer it from a high-yield savings account you keep separate from the investments, and you don't feel your stomach drop when you do it. That night, you sit down and actually run the numbers, all the way through, for the first time. Your investment accounts returned just under $34,000 last year, between growth and reinvested dividends. Your salary, after the last raise, is $71,000. The gap between what your money made and what you made at work has never been this small. This is the part that's hard to explain to anyone who hasn't lived it. Your labor is still the biggest number on the page, but it's no longer the only number doing real work. Somewhere in the last 7 years, without a ceremony or an announcement, your money started having a job too. Priya, from Quality Control, drives a leased Audi and lives in a two-bedroom condo downtown with a view of the river. Everyone assumes she's doing better than you are, better than most people at the plant. You've seen her car payment, mentioned once in passing, $640 a month, plus insurance that runs closer to $200. Her condo runs $2,400. She's not doing anything unusual. She's doing what looks, from the outside, like success. You don't know her full financial picture, and you don't ask. But you notice that when her hours got cut for 2 months during a slow quarter, she picked up a second part-time job within the week. You never had to. That's the actual shift, not the number itself. What the number lets you not have to do. You still ride the bike 3 days a week. You still eat the same lunch. Nobody at Ferris has any reason to think your life looks any different than it did 5 years ago. On paper, at work, nothing about you has changed. There's a Saturday that fall when the plant's HVAC contractor, doing a favor for a coworker, quotes Meg's parents $11,000 to replace their furnace before winter. Her parents don't have it, not comfortably. You and Meg cover it without discussion, the way you'd have covered a $40 pizza a decade earlier. Her father tries to write you a check for half. You tell him the furnace was a wedding gift, 4 years late. He laughs, uncertain whether you're joking. You're not really, but you let him think you are, because that's easier for both of you than the actual arithmetic. Underneath it, everything has changed. Level 5. When work becomes optional. At 34, your supervisor offers you a shift lead promotion that comes with a $6,000 raise and a mandatory move to third shift, permanently, no exceptions. 2 years ago, you'd have taken it without thinking. The number would have been the whole decision. Instead, you ask for a week to consider it, run your numbers, and turn it down. Not because you can't use the money, because your accounts, combined, have crossed $780,000, and the calculation that used to be simple, more money always wins, isn't simple anymore. Third shift would cost you evenings with Meg, mornings with the two of you still asleep at the same time, a version of your life you're not willing to trade for a raise you don't structurally need. Your supervisor doesn't understand the refusal. Neither does Dana, who overhears about it and asks, not unkindly, if everything's okay. Everything's fine, you tell her. It's the truth, but it's not the whole truth, and you both feel that. That winter, your mother's roof starts leaking into the upstairs hallway. The repair quote comes in at $8,200. You pay for it outright, transfer it the same afternoon, and don't mention the amount to anyone in the family. Your brother offers to pay you back over time. You tell him not to worry about it, and you mean it, not as a generous gesture you're proud of, but as something that simply doesn't move the needle for you the way it would have a decade earlier. You notice the language shifting in your own head. You don't have to take the overtime shift. You don't have to stay at a job with a manager who takes credit for your fixes. You choose to, some weeks, because the work itself is fine and the routine suits you. But the word have has quietly been replaced by choose. And that replacement turns out to be the actual definition of the freedom you spent 9 years building toward. The bike is still parked outside every morning. You could buy the dealership at this point and pay cash. You don't want to. It stopped being about what you couldn't afford a long time ago. Level 6. The part nobody warned you about. Nobody tells you that being quietly rich is lonelier than being visibly broke. You cross $1.3 million the same month your childhood friend Marcus, who's been struggling since his contracting business slowed down, asks to borrow $3,000 to cover a gap before a job pays out. You have it. You don't blink at having it. What you blink at is the conversation that follows, the careful math you do in your head about whether lending it changes the relationship, whether he'll ever mention it again, whether you'll resent him if he doesn't pay it back on schedule, even though the number means almost nothing to you now. You lend it. He pays half back over 4 months and goes quiet about the rest. You never bring it up. Something between you shifts anyway, small and permanent, the way a hairline crack changes a windshield even before it spreads. Meg is the only person who knows the real numbers, and even that took years to feel normal instead of exposing. You've never told your parents the full picture. You've never told Dana or Priya or Walt, who's still the one person whose sentence started all of it. Part of you wants to. Part of you is afraid of what changes the second people know. The requests, the assumptions, the way money makes people perform differently around you, whether they mean to or not. There's a specific kind of fear that shows up around $1 million that never showed up around $10,000. At $10,000, losing it would hurt. At $1.3 million, losing it would be a different kind of life, and some nights you catch yourself running downside scenarios that have nothing to do with anything actually happening. Just the mind's way of guarding something it's not used to holding. You realize, somewhere in your mid-30s, that the number stopped being the goal a long time ago and quietly became a responsibility instead. You thought freedom would feel loud. It's closer to silence, the specific silence of a Tuesday morning where nothing is wrong, nothing needs fixing, and you still get up at 6:15 out of habit rather than necessity. You start noticing small things you never used to track. How a conversation changes shape the moment someone finds out you did well with investing. How people who ask casual questions about your finances are almost never asking casually how easy it would be to let the number become the whole personality if you let it. You don't. You still show up at 6:15. You still bring the same lunch. But you carry a private awareness now that most of the people around you are one unexpected bill away from a crisis you could solve without noticing, and you've stopped mentioning that gap out loud because saying it never once made anyone feel better. Richer than everyone around you was supposed to be the ending of the story. It turns out to be the part where a different, quieter story starts. It's 6:15 on a Wednesday morning again, 9 years after the first one. You're locking the same bike, new tires, same frame, to the same rack outside Ferris Metal Works. Dana still parks 2 spots over. Different SUV now, same habit. She waves. You wave back. The coffee in the break room still costs the same 75 cents it did the year Walt told you to pay yourself first. The plant looks exactly like it did the morning your account held $211 and a flat tire felt like a crisis. Nothing about the outside of this has changed. You clip your badge on. Somewhere behind you, the bike sits chained to the same rack, worth maybe $180 now with the new tires. The accounts nobody here has ever seen crossed $1.4 million last week. You think about Walt's sentence, the one that started all of it, the one he probably doesn't remember saying. You think about the timing belt you couldn't afford, and the Audi payment you never made, and the roof you paid for without a second thought, and Marcus's $1,500 you'll never mention again. The math changed a long time ago. What you didn't expect was everything else it would quietly change along with it. Who you tell things to, what you worry about at 2 a.m., how it feels to be the richest person in a room where nobody knows it. You still don't know if you'd do it differently. You just know the version of you locking up a $140 bike 9 years ago couldn't have imagined this version, standing in the same spot, carrying a number that big, and a silence that heavy at the same time. And if this story made you think about the difference between looking wealthy and actually being wealthy, hit the like button and subscribe for more stories like this one. And I'm curious, would you rather build wealth quietly, the way this story did, or be open about it with the people around you? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.